My name is William George, and I'm a researcher for the Kleros Cooperative. So to recall, Kleros is a decentralized dispute resolution platform that uses blockchain and crowdsourcing as its sort of core ingredients. So this provides interesting challenges. Because blockchain environments are often very hostile, there are lots of attackers, and you don't generally have this kinds of safeguards that a Web 2 platform might have where a centralized actor can intervene. So instead, one has to build Web3 applications in a sufficiently robust way that those kinds of like attack resistance features are just baked into a protocol without requiring centralized intervention. And this has sparked a lot of research in computer science and economics, particularly, to try to make the Kleros protocol as robust as possible, while at the same time providing good and cheap, affordable dispute resolution. There's a lot of other interesting research that people at the Kleros Cooperative do, particularly around legal research. I have more of a technical background. My background is a mathematician. So today I'm going to be talking more about the technical research, but I encourage you to check out our blog and our sort of writings to see the other kinds of things we're doing as well. So I get into this. I briefly recall what Kleros is. Decentralized dispute resolution. How does this work? Well, imagine that as a sort of canonical example, Alice, a small business owner, hires Bob, a freelancer, to provide her with some kind of service. Maybe Bob is building Alice's website or providing some kind of marketing service. And then what do? Well, they go to an interface that looks like this. And then Alice will deposit the payment for Bob into a smart contract escrow. So she'll send off a payment in cryptocurrency, and it will be held by a smart contract. And then ultimately, if Alice is happy with Bob's work, she'll click a button saying release payment, and then the payment will go automatically to Bob. If Alice is unhappy, well, then she can trigger a dispute. And how does this work? Well, the core idea of Kleros is that you have some pool of people who are using the platform to provide dispute resolution services. They resolve disputes in their free time, and some random selection of them will be drawn to judge any given case. So the sort of first set of interesting research questions is around how does this random selection process work? And then later in the talk, I'll get to the questions around, okay, like once the jurors are selected, what do they do? How do they vote? How are they incentivized? Okay, but first starting with how do we pick a pool of jurors? Well, in order to be a juror on Kleros, you need to possess a crypto token, the Kleros PNK token, and then the idea is that you will stake it into a court. So we have what we call a tree of courts in the Kleros protocol that judge different kinds of disputes. So, for example, if you have expertise in Solidity development, there's like a development court where you can go and judge disputes related to whether Solidity code has bugs in it or is well developed. If you want to judge marketing services disputes, there's another court for that. Notice that in order to stake in a court in Kleros 1.0, there's no formal requirement that you prove that you're actually an expert in something. Instead, and this will be a theme throughout all of this talk, there are sort of economic incentives for you to stake in the court where you have actual expertise, because as you will see sort of later on, if you try to judge disputes that you aren't actually good at judging or are qualified to consider, then you will lose money on average, and you as a juror will be sort of incentivized to remove yourself from that court. Okay, so once you have a given court, it has some people in it. They each have some number of tokens that they've staked, maybe a distribution that looks like this. And then how do we draw the juror? Well, your odds of being drawn as a juror are directly proportional to the number of tokens you staked, at least in Kleros 1.0. So if you draw 3 jurors to judge a given dispute, maybe your first draw is this devil person, second draw is somebody else, and then it's possible for someone to get more than one spot in a jury. So the devil because he has 45% of the total tokens, he has 45% on any given draw. So on the third draw, he has 45% chance of getting another spot. And then if you sort of calculate the odds, you can say that with a distribution that looks like this, someone that has almost half of the total stake has around there 43% chance of getting 2 of the 3 spots. And then ultimately, whether this model is secure in the sense that it can't be taken over by a given actor or a group of colluding actors comes down to whether that participant or colluding group has 50% of the stake or not. So as long as sort of one actor or coordinating group of actors has less than 50% of the stake, ultimately any given draw with a large enough panel of people will, on average, have less than half of the attacker votes, so that honest people, or at least sort of economically rational and independent acting people, will have a majority. And why is Kleros 1.0 like this? It's sort of strange. One juror can have more than one vote. Why were those choices made for Kleros 1.0? Well, that basically comes down to a lack of good blockchain identity systems that existed when Kleros 1.0 was developed. So you could imagine imposing constraints in the smart contract that a given Ethereum address could only get one vote. That seems natural. One person should only have one vote. However, if you did that, then people who are interacting with the platform honestly, well, they may keep all of their PNK Kleros tokens on one address and be subjected to this limit of one vote. But the attackers, anyone seriously trying to attack the platform, would just split their tokens up over multiple addresses. And then they would get multiple votes. So they would actually have an even sort of bigger outsized advantage than just having their number of votes weighted by the number of tokens they have. Okay, so what can we do? Are there better blockchain identity systems now that we can be used to improve upon this? And a lot of improvements have been made over the years to have better blockchain identity. One tool that we at the Kleros Cooperative developed is called Proof of Humanity, which is a proof of personhood tool, Sybil resistance list. So the idea is that it's a curated list, and basically each human being should only be able to get one profile on this list. And then ultimately, if there's a disagreement about whether a new submission, a new profile, belongs to somebody who's already on the list, so that's to say if someone is trying to get more than one profile, then that triggers a Kleros dispute, and Kleros itself solves this question of whether a new profile deserves to be added to the list or not. Okay, but now as soon as you have a tool that limits people to one profile, one person, you could use that, you can piggyback off of that to limit people to one vote per address. Because you can, for example, require that an Ethereum address that people use to stake on Kleros also be an Ethereum address that is registered on Proof of Humanity, and then someone can't just sort of easily get around this barrier by splitting up their tokens over multiple addresses because they can only get one Proof of Humanity address. Okay, so imagine that this mechanism is perfectly secure, that Proof of Humanity works like a char where you can only ever get one address. Then what's your attack sort of mechanism, like a model? How resistant to attacks are you? Well, the one person can only ever get one vote, so this double person, even though he controls 45% of the tokens, he can only get one vote, and when you take the next draw, he's just removed from the pool of people that can be drawn. Everybody else's odds improve, the devil can't be drawn at all, it's impossible to draw the same person twice, and you have a security model where the percentage chance of being attacked is 0. So what happens if Proof of Humanity was not perfectly secure? Someone could get multiple addresses. Maybe the list is resistant. It's hard to get additional addresses, but someone pays other people to register for the list and then takes their key or something, so that there's an economic cost to getting a second address, but it's not insurmountable. What's the attack model now on Kleros drawing if you require that each person, in order to be staked as a juror, use a proof of humanity profile? Well, the attacker may have a bunch of addresses, and everybody else, let's say, only has one. So now the attack, when you draw some user, say you draw the attacker, he isn't removed from the juror pool because he has a bunch of other addresses. His tokens are all split up into different addresses. And if you draw somebody else, they are removed from the juror pool. You can't draw them again because this juror only had one address. And what that means is everybody else's odds improve, including the attacker. So now on the third draw, what are the odds that the attacker gets 2 out of 3 draws? Can be calculated like this for this distribution. So in this example, the attacker started with 45% of the tokens, and they have a slightly higher than 50% chance of getting 2 of the 3 spots. But that's what's interesting here is that even though the attacker broke the proof of personhood tool, they didn't completely break the juror drawing mechanism. Their odds of getting 2 out of 3 spots did not like go to 100 or something. They still have a chance of having a successful attack, which is around 50%. And if you think about this, what happened is that the attacker is drawn with replacement while everybody else is drawn without replacement, sort of in the language of probability. So the attacker's odds improve a bit with each draw when somebody else is removed. But still, like, as long as there are lots of people that have small percentages of stakes, removing one of them isn't going to improve the attacker's draw odds that much. So ultimately, there's still some threshold for what percentage of the stake the attacker needs to control in order to take over a system like this. And our security model winds up being that either you need to have proof of personhood be secure, or the attacker cannot control more than X percent of the stake, or the X percent depends somewhat on what the distribution of the other jurors' stakes are. Okay, so this is interesting in that the kind of like 2 security models here, the kind of pure token weighting of Kleros 1.0 and this more sort of social mechanism of using a proof of personhood screen, kind of add together. You kind of have like a Swiss cheese defense in the sense that, like, you know, a slice of Swiss cheese has some holes in it, but like if you layer like multiple slices together, the holes will be in different places. So it's unlikely that like you'll have one hole that goes all the way through. So you have complementary layers of defense, which is a very interesting result. And you know, you raises the question of what other layers could one conceivably add to the Kleros protocol that would provide complementary defense in this way, that don't dilute the existing attack model too much while still adding a new kind of like orthogonal attack resistance. Okay, and one idea that we've thought a lot about to try to sort of continue in this vein is to use what are called soulbound tokens. So soulbound tokens are this idea that was introduced in the Decentralized Society paper by Glenn Weil, Pua Olhaver, and Vitalik Buterin a couple years ago at this point, where they want to continue on this idea of like adding more social mechanisms to Web3. So their idea is that you should have tokens which are non-transferable. So because they're non-transferable, you sort of take out the financial aspect that is so present in so much of Web3. And instead, like these tokens, which are kind of like NFTs, but again, non-transferable, it might attest to some aspect of your social identity. So maybe there's some kind of qualification, you get like a diploma from some kind of school, maybe you took like an online Solidity development course, and the school directly issued you an SBT to your wallet. They can also be negative. So for example, if you take out an under-collateralized loan from some Web3 protocol, and you don't pay it back, then maybe you get like a negative credit score sort of entry. And the idea is that you kind of have to take the good with the bad, that you develop identity over time. You have one wallet that has all of these things in it, and you can't sort of get rid of the bad things, the unpaid loan note, without also burning all of your positive reputation and sort of starting over and completely creating an entirely new wallet from scratch. So then, like, you have like a notion of reputation and identity that looks much more like what people have in the traditional world. Like they'll have a credit score or a CV that has, you know, some good things on it, some bad things on it, and then ultimately, you know, like someone providing them with a loan, for example, will look over the good and the bad and make some kind of holistic decision. Okay. So one idea for how SBTs could be distributed, so we had this idea, again, of like an institution like the Web3 school that gives facilitated development courses, issuing you directly SBTs to your wallet. Another idea we've had that kind of bootstrap the ecosystem of SBTs is that Kleros itself could be used for distributing SBTs. So imagine that Alice wants to say that she's an expert in some subject. She is an expert in Solidity development or whatever. Then what you can do is that Alice can submit herself to a curated list. This is also basically how Proof of Humanity works, where she provides some deposit. She submits her profile to a list, and then if some time passes, some like delay where her submission is challengeable, expires, then the SBT will just automatically appear in her wallet. But if in the time, the sort of submission time, some challenger comes along and says, no, you're not a subject, an expert in subject X, I've looked at your profile and you don't meet the requirements of this list, then the challenger can also provide a deposit and challenge this entry, and this creates a Kleros case where the jury will make the decision of whether the user belongs on the list or not. Okay, so once people have SBTs, what can you do with them? Well, we've thought a lot recently about weighting people's odds of being drawn in Kleros cases by the SBTs they have. And so imagine that like I have a bunch of users who sort of look like this. They have different SBTs. This guy in the green shirt has multiple different SBTs. So then the idea here is that you draw people who have kind of different SBTs to try to get a panel that has diverse points of view based on being represented by people who have diverse SBTs. So this is work that's sort of directly inspired by Glenn Weil and sort of his collaborators' work and the Decentralized Society paper and others, where their sort of big application that they think a lot about is quadratic funding. So this sort of mechanism to fund public goods, kind of provide matching funding if people submit funds to a matching pool, how much matching funds should be provided. And their idea is that they want to have fund matching that gives extra weight when you have contributions from really wide, diverse sets of people that represent different communities, as sort of indicated by the different SBTs they have. And then in Kleros, you can maybe, try to apply those ideas, and you're like, okay, like the pool of jurors should have different points of view. That's sort of healthy. But if it's hard to create malicious SBTs, then like particularly for like one SBT breaks, it's hard to break the others. So it also adds some level of attack resistance. Then you can sort of do the same kind of weighting. And in this sort of example, we have kind of a weighting formula that's directly inspired by the Decentralized Society paper's weighting formula, where people are weighted more or less by the different SBTs they have, and in particular the guy with the green shirt is weighted more because he had these two different SBTs. In particular, one of his SBTs, he was the only person who had it. He was the only person who had this sort of POAP from ECC. Okay, and then again, like there's a lot of social science research that shows that the diverse groups of problem solvers, if you have a group of people that are trying to collectively solve a problem, where if you have different inputs, different people with different experiences, they can in many cases outperform a group of people that are individually high performing, but more kind of homogenous. And so if you have like a diverse group like this, you can hopefully, ideally produce better dispute resolution as a service. Okay. The Glenwile and his collaborators raised some interesting questions about what exactly like how this weighting formula could work and like how it could be improved that we've thought about in its versions adapted to Kleros. So if you think about this idea, okay, like people are being weighted by their SPTs, we're trying to get like diverse points of view. Like ultimately, you're breaking people into groups, and like the simplest formula, you might say, okay, like each SPT sort of corresponds to a group. If I have like the diploma SPT, I'm in the group. If I don't, I'm not in the group. Like then I try to get different points of view as evidenced by like people from each of those groups with each of the SPTs. But a maybe more nuanced point of view might say, okay, like all the SPTs are not really like independent groups. Some of them are kind of correlated. Like maybe all the people who went to ECC and got the ECC POAP also have a POAP from like the ECC side event. And it doesn't make sense to consider those as like two separate groups. And then you get into like what is essentially a clustering problem. If I have this group of participants, how can I like meaningfully break them into groups that like say something about their social identity, and then use those groups to weight them to draw them as Kleros jurors or to weight their quadratic funding contributions. So there are a lot of modern clustering algorithms that draw on sort of machine learning kind of tools. You can, like a sort of classic example is to use what's called spectral clustering. So it's one of these kinds of like very linear algebra based kind of tools. You create a matrix of indicating which people have which SPTs, sort of as we see in the lower right here. And then you can use that to assign clusters. So for those who are interested, that you take what's called the graph Laplacian of this matrix, and you can look at its eigenvalues, and it turns out that if you had people who were perfectly broken into distinct clusters, this sort of eigenvalue approach, looking at the graph Laplacian's eigenvalues, would very neatly tell you who's in which cluster. And if you think, okay, people are mostly in one or another cluster, then if you sort of create small perturbations of like the graph of who has which SPT, it doesn't change the eigenvalues too much, so you can ultimately read off like more or less who's in which cluster from this information. And then the question is like, okay, like what's the attack model of this? We were looking at the attack model of sort of pure token weighting drawing in Kleros versus like token weighting versus with a proof of humanity screen. Like if I do something like this where I have token weighting, but it's reweighted by the SPTs people have, what does an attacker need to break that system? How does it compare to the existing mechanisms? Is it complementary in the same way that a proof of personage screen is complementary, where you sort of just add to the attack resistance without taking too much away from either of the sort of existing attack resistance layers? And we've done a lot of research on that. It's still pretty, there are a lot of open questions. So if you're interested in this, let us know, and there's a lot to attack. So you can sort of say, okay, like, what can the attacker do? What are the like main like attack kind of vectors? Well, one obvious thing the attacker could do would be to, if they were able to produce fake SPTs, would be to give a bunch of fake SPTs to themselves. So everybody else has their sort of honest SPTs, and the attacker has a bunch of fake SPTs. How does this, like, how much of an impact will this have on the groups that the spectral clustering algorithm produces? Another thing the attacker could do would be that, like, maybe they give a few fake SPTs to themselves, and then they give other fake SPTs to other people. Maybe, like, depending on exactly how the attacker has broken the distribution of some SPT, maybe they are capable of that, maybe not. But if they are, then that means that they can try to make other people look artificially more similar than they really are by like connecting them through these connections that don't actually exist. And by doing so, the attacker can make themselves stand out to be like, oh, I'm really the distinct person with the different credentials and the different experiences. So then there are all kinds of interesting questions about like, in what circumstances is one attack worse than the other? Like, which of these looks more like the kinds of attack models that you already had with pure token weighting, for example? So lots of interesting open research questions. I encourage people to read up on sort of some of the documents we have if they're interested in more information on this. Okay, so now what are some attacks on juror selection? So we said that like with the token weighting model, like you were attack resistant as long as an attacker or an attacking coalition didn't have more than half of the tokens. So we sometimes call this the 51% attack or the whale attack. And note that this name is inspired by a similar attack on the consensus algorithms used in Bitcoin or Ethereum, proof of work or proof of stake. And that's not really a coincidence. In some sense, it's a very similar attack, and I'll talk more about the connections between consensus algorithms and Kleros later on in the talk. So ultimately, in a kind of like broader sense, when you're not just purely token weighting people, but also like weighting biased BTs or using a proof of personhood screen, then the sort of more broadly you ask, okay, like how capable is an attacker of getting many votes to try to take over a juror panel? The ultimate mechanism that we have envisioned to deal with the 1% attacks, which is also what, in some sense, has been done to deal with 51% sort of points of disagreement in proof of consensus algorithms, is to use what's called a fork. So you could imagine that if some attacker had just completely taken over Kleros, they had over half of the tokens, then you could create a clone of the Kleros smart contracts that you redeploy everything. New cases are migrated to this like new version of Kleros, and you can like cut out the attacker. Like you can copy everybody's token balances except for the attacker, and then he or she is just shut out of the new version of Kleros. So as such, the attacker has priori invested into a bunch of tokens that would lose much of their value because they were no longer usable to mess with this like with Kleros going forward with the new cases that are deployed on the new version, while still maintaining the community you had of everybody else. We've thought a lot about exactly what are the best ways to facilitate this. Like anybody can, all of the Kleros code is open source, so anybody can make a copy of Kleros at any time. But you can imagine that if you have like difficult subjective Kleros cases, which Kleros is designed to handle, where maybe sometimes you have honest disagreement over whether who should win the case. But you can have like edge cases over whether something was really an attack or not. Whether some disagreement, where someone like looks like they've taken over the system by having like half of the votes vote for something that other people view as wrong. Is that really an attack, or is it just people honestly disagreeing? So we have thought about a mechanism that will basically allow people to express both whether they think what they think like an answer should be to a dispute, but also whether they think that it like is worth forking if somebody answers differently. And this could help people coordinate over like when like really the community should migrate to a fork. So another kind of core attack on Kleros juror selection is attacks on the random number generation. So Kleros' random number generation currently draws from the round-down mechanism that's used by Ethereum proof of stake itself. And you can do like analysis to say, okay, like what are the profiles of different possible attackers? Ultimately, the kind of most threatening attack profile is someone who's also a block producer in Ethereum, because that gives them some ability to mess with the round-down mechanism. Those are also the people that are the most capable of censoring transactions. So if I have like a big block producer that's capable of messing with Randall, like what does that cost? How much do they have to harm, do they have to take upon themselves? How much cost do they have to take upon themselves to mess with the Randall enough to produce a biased Kleros result? So this is something that we thought a lot about, and it's possible to improve upon the mechanisms we currently have. One possible improvement is to use what's called a verifiable delay function. So Chainlink has developed a verifiable, the Chainlink VRF, which is in this vein. So potentially that could be used in some future deployment of Kleros. Okay, so now we have our jurors. The jurors have been selected. What happens next? So the jurors are going to vote somehow. They're going to give us information on what they think the correct outcome of the case is, and then somehow the system is going to aggregate that into a collective decision that's going to be executed. And then also the jurors are going to receive incentives, penalties and rewards based on how they vote, with the idea being that the system should push them to vote well. And then the main mechanism that Kleros uses for this is called a Schelling point, or sometimes called a focal point. So this is an idea that dates to Thomas Schelling, who was an American economist. He eventually won the Nobel Prize. And a Schelling point is a solution that people tend to use when they're trying to coordinate, when they're trying to come to sort of the same decision with other people. In the absence of communication, because it seems natural or special somehow. So an example that Schelling observed empirically was when he asked people if they want to meet, say tomorrow, in New York City somewhere, but they don't know where. They just know somewhere in New York City, and they don't know when. It's just sometime tomorrow. What do they do? And he found that many people said they would meet at Grand Central Station, at the information desk, specifically at Grand Central Station, at noon. Why Grand Central Station? Well, Grand Central Station has a sort of a tradition as a distinguished meeting point. If you don't know anything else about the person you're trying to meet, you might expect them to also go to this place because it has this tradition as a meeting point. Why noon? Well, it's a sort of distinguished time. Any other time in the day would work as well. 3:52 would be fine, but people are going to choose that because it's not like a distinguished time. Any other place would work as well. You could meet in some random basement in a bar, but the average person won't think of that in the same sort of distinguished way that they might think about Grand Central Station. Notice that this experiment depends a lot on sort of the social norms of a group. If you're playing this game, this experiment with some friends, and you always meet up at the bar, then maybe the bar is the distinguished meeting point. So Schelling points depend a lot on the sort of social context. And then the idea is that in Kleros, the honest answer, the answer that you come to a dispute when you spend time to analyze the evidence, to look at the case, to reason as best as you can about who's right and what the best outcome is, that answer should be a Schelling point. You expect the other people that are reviewing this case, the jurors that are also voting in your voting round, and then potentially jurors in an appeal round that will be looking at the same case, to come to a similar decision. Maybe people don't always come to exactly the same decision. You have subjective cases, people can disagree sometimes, but you expect that people will more often than not come to the same decision that you come to, so you will vote for the honest answer, expecting everybody else to vote for the honest answer. Okay, and this runs into issues if you have more than two possible answers. So imagine that you have these four answers here. Three of them are pretty reasonable. Bob the freelancer should be given an extension of a few more days to finish the job. How long is debatable, but like three sort of reasonable extensions versus a different answer which you think is wrong, and as the juror viewing this case, where you should just refund Alice. And you might have an issue where if your voting system is to take the option that got the most votes, what is called the plurality or first past the post voting system, then that might result in the vote splitting. The three honest answers might split the honest votes between them, and then the dishonest answer, the answer just refunding Alice, will sort of get over the threshold and win the case, even with sort of a small plurality of the vote, because the other votes were divided. In some sense, this is an even worse issue in a Schelling point system than in like voting for traditional elections, if you were voting for parliament or something, because in a Schelling point system where people are gravitating towards distinguished answers, if there are several good answers and one distinguished answer, that wrong answer can become an alternative Schelling point, and people could gravitate towards it, expecting others to do the same, even if they don't have a particular interest in that answer winning, or they don't think it's right. Just because it's distinguished, they could gravitate towards it. So you want to avoid a situation where rival Schelling points to the honest answer can appear. Okay, so a standard solution to this issue in classical elections, like political elections for government posts, is to ask jurors for more information. Instead of just asking jurors to provide a single vote for like their preferred candidate, you ask them to give you more information about how they feel about the different candidates. One classic way of doing this is to ask people to rank their ballots. So here we have 4 candidates. You rank the candidates 1 to 4. You can generally rank candidates 1 to n for n candidates. Your first choice, second choice, etc. And then once people have all ranked their ballots like that, there are a lot of different ways that you can combine those votes into a collective decision. And really, there are very many voting systems that people have studied that, as we will see in a moment, have sort of different trade-offs, different advantages and disadvantages for how you come up with this collective decision based on people's votes. So one like classic approach is to use what's called the Borda system, where for each place that you rank a candidate in, or an option in, that option is attributed a certain number of points. And so I rank a candidate first, it gets 3 points, second candidate second gets 2 points, etc. And then at the end, you look at which option has the most votes, or most points, and that option wins. Another possibility is what's called the instant runoff system. So here, you essentially simulate a series of runoffs. So you look at which option has the fewest first place votes after everybody votes, and then you eliminate that option. So for example, I have this vote up here on the top, where I rank the pink angel first, yellow angel second, etc. Devil is the last. And then people tabulate the votes and see that if you just count the first choice votes for the moment, the pink angel finished last. Other people didn't agree with me that the pink angel was the right choice. So the pink angel is eliminated, and then my vote is reattributed to the yellow angel, because that was my second choice vote. And you do that for everybody whose first choice was eliminated. And you keep doing that. You look at which option has the fewest sort of running total votes at the end of each round. You eliminate them, you keep going until somebody wins. And if you think about this, this is equivalent to what would have happened if you'd had a series of runoffs, and you eliminate one candidate at a time. You have as many rounds of the runoff as you have candidates, or candidates minus 1. And assuming everybody votes sort of consistently according to their ranking, you don't need people to vote in each round. You can just simulate how they would vote from the ranking they give you at the beginning. Australia uses this for parliamentary elections. The Academy Awards uses this. So this is another sort of classic choice. So, of course, there are ways that jurors could vote that give you more information on their preferences that aren't just a ranking. So one choice that has been studied a lot in the social choice theory research, so this sort of academic field of studying voting systems, is what's called approval voting. So here, people just click whether they approve or disapprove of each option. They give you a binary choice per option. And you can approve as many as you want, you can disapprove as many as you want. Maybe all of the options are worthy of approval. Maybe none of the options are worthy of approval. So in our example here, the voter approves all 3 of the angels and disapproves the devil. Another similar idea is what's called jugement majoritaire, or majority judgment, which is a sort of voting system that has been studied recently by some French researchers. where the idea is that it's kind of like approval voting in that you give like a rating to each option, and you can give multiple candidates the same rating. But it's kind of like Yelp style voting, like like you can you for each option you say whether it's great or like really okay or sort of like poor or like really awful, and you give each option a sort of classification, but multiple options can have the same classification. None of them might have a given classification. So like here I give two options, the category of great, and I give the devil awful, and then you can aggregate this somehow into a collective outcome. Okay, and then the sort of the natural question is, okay, what's the right voting system? What's the best voting system? And it turns out that every voting system has issues and has flaws and limitations in certain ways, and there is no ideal voting system, no ideal voting aggregation system. A classic result in this sense was that really sort of like gave birth to this field of social choice theory, or at least this particular approach of considering the trade-offs, advantages and disadvantages of different voting systems, is Arrow's impossibility theorem, which says basically that if you have a ranked voting system, so this original theorem only applies to ranked voting systems, that has really sort of basic properties that you would expect from a voting system. There's no dictator, so there's no one whose vote just sort of always determines the collective outcome. A few other sort of properties like that. Then there will always be some situations where there are strategic voting. So someone will always have there will exist edge cases where someone might have the incentive to tactically vote, to not vote for their true preferences, but to vote for some manipulated vote that will help their actual preferences win. And we've studied similar sort of ideas. Let's see how they apply to Kleros. And we have a theorem in a paper that I published a couple years ago at this point, where you see something similar, that if you have more than three options, so non-binary choices, ranked voting again, and now you sort of bring back in the incentive system, which I'm going to talk more about in a moment. So this like notion of how much jurors are paid or penalized based on how they vote. And if you have these core ingredients such that the voting and incentive system should have sort of basic 51% attack resistance, then there will be some situations where jurors will determine that their best payoff comes from basically voting the options out of the order they think they actually have of winning. So we thought the whole idea of this sort of Schelling point voting is to incentivize people to vote for what they think the community will vote for. People will sort of think that the honest answer is a Schelling point, and then you expect other people to do that, and then the community is voting for the honest answers. And it turns out that if you have ranked voting, the sort of way that pathologies manifest themselves in this world, is that there will be situations where even though you think the community is going to vote one way, you can exploit the payoff system by voting in a slightly different way, manipulating the order things are in to try to get a slightly higher payoff. So that's weird, but that it's sort of unsurprising given the kind of state of research on these kinds of strategic voting in traditional voting systems. You can have there are lots of interesting open research questions to expand this kind of idea. One thing that people have thought about in social choice theory, particularly in what's called computational social choice theory, is what happens if you limit the computational power of some of the participants. So, for example, if you have an attacker who is trying to determine whether a given way they can manipulate their vote will benefit them, and they have a ranking of n options, there are n factorial ways they could cast their vote. So there are lots of computationally many ways they could cast their vote. It's the same for all the other participants. So if an attacker is simulating what's going to happen for each possible manipulation, that takes a lot of computational power. And what happens if you limit their ability to think to polynomial time or something? What kinds of attacks are they capable of doing sort of with good probability? And you can do something similar in this sort of setting in Kleros, the theorem I just showed on the previous slide, it takes the point of view that the users are simulating how other jurors are going to vote before they cast their potentially strategic vote. And in that theorem, there's no limit on how long they can spend, what computational resources they can spend simulating the other users. What happens if you apply some kind of limit? Do they still wind up with sort of non-negligible probability in situations where they're incentivized to cast tactical votes? So there are lots of interesting research questions in sort of that, in these directions. Okay, and then once you accept that these theorems like arrows and possibility theorem say that there's no perfect voting system, and every voting system has some advantages, some flaws, decades of social choice theory has been spent looking at different voting systems and different properties you want voting systems to have, and determining, okay, like this one has this property, but you don't have this one. Any voting system that has this property, like, excludes this other property, and things like this. And you can have these like giant tables of saying, okay, like this voting system has this, and this, but not this. This other voting system has that, but not this and that. And ultimately, what voting system makes sense for you and your application depends a lot on sort of what your priorities are. And we've done similar research for Kleros. So we have this somewhat smaller table of the different voting systems we've looked at and the different properties we've identified as being important for Kleros, certain types of attack resistance, being resistant to having these sort of like similar options, though, like that I had before with the 3 similar options and one deviant option to avoid vote splitting issues, things like that. So there are, of course, many other voting properties that might be relevant for Kleros that could be added to this table. Maybe other voting systems that could have better properties that we haven't thought about yet. So there's definitely lots of room for future research to expand on this table and give us a richer sense of what exactly our options are for future versions of Kleros. Okay, and now notice that there's obviously all these questions around the jurors voting in, whether Alice or Bob is right, like what the appropriate outcome is for the case of Alice versus Bob. But notice that there's, so there's this obvious form of voting where people are actually voting on the outcome of the case. But there are lots of things that are sort of de facto voting that also exist in the Kleros protocol, sort of voting in disguise. So, for example, in Kleros, there's this notion of appeals. Cases can be appealed, and that results in a larger panel of jurors being drawn. And when a case is up for appeal, because this future larger panel has to take time and effort to review the case, they need to be compensated for that effort. Some fees have to be put in to cover that. Some appeal fees have to be raised for the case to be appealed. And there's a mechanism of sort of litigation crowdfunding, basically, to enable people to raise funds for the case they think should win the dispute, so it can be appealed. And notice that when you're deciding whether to fund an appeal on behalf of one of multiple options, that's also a kind of voting. It's a different type of thing. It's a different voting, but it also has these sort of similar issues when you have non-binary choices, and you have to think about what the right voting system is for this voting situation as well. So that's something we've thought about. For more details on that, check out our yellow paper, which has detailed sort of explanation of how we see the appropriate non-binary litigation crowdfunding mechanisms. Okay, so now I've talked a lot about how Kleros voting relates to the academic field of social choice theory, which is a field that's traditionally associated with economics. A lot of social choice theorists are in economics departments. Now, there's another field that we've drawn a lot of sort of ideas from in related to how Kleros voting and incentive systems work, that is more traditionally associated with computer science departments, and that field is called peer prediction. So in peer prediction, you often have the point of view that you have some crowdsourced platform, and you're trying to incentivize people to provide good crowdsourced answers. So it's very much in the sort of setting of Kleros. And the standard thing that you ask people to do, voters in this situation, is to not only provide what they think the answer to a question is, but also ask them what percentage of other voters will vote for each answer. So you ask them to predict what the sort of rates of voting will be for each of the other answers. And like a core idea why this is useful is there's a cute example for this that I think dates to Prelec that asks people what is the capital of the U.S. state of Pennsylvania, and then similarly, like the peer prediction is you ask people, the same voters, what the other people will say the capital is. And the thing is that people who know the answer will know that the answer is the city of Harrisburg. But if you don't know that, then you might be inclined to think that the answer is Philadelphia, because Philadelphia is a large city in Pennsylvania that has a lot of history. So a lot of particularly during the sort of colonial period, and might have seemed to have been a natural choice to be picked as the state capital, but it wasn't. They picked Harrisburg. So the people who don't know will say Philadelphia is the answer, and they'll also think other people will think Philadelphia is the answer because they sort of don't realize that this is a trick question. And the people who do know the answer will vote for Harrisburg, but they realize there's this issue where people will drift towards Philadelphia, so they will vote. Other people will vote for Philadelphia. They think the answer is Harrisburg, but their predictions for other people's votes are Philadelphia. And then when you tabulate the votes, you notice that there are more votes for Harrisburg than there were predictions of votes for Harrisburg. So Harrisburg is what's called surprisingly popular. So several peer prediction systems work on this sort of logic of like you somehow identify that there's an option which is surprisingly popular, and then you maybe give that option extra weight towards being selected as the outcome, the collective answer that people are voting on, or somehow you use this information when you're weighting people's incentives. And this is great. One question that people often ask us in Kleros, or related to Kleros, is what happens if the majority is wrong? You have like your broad community of people that even after they put in the time and effort to review the case of Alice versus Bob, they just come to the wrong conclusion. That some like panel of like well-enlightened experts that maybe know a little more about the field or whatever would have picked some other answer. And this sort of surprisingly popular logic could be used to be like, okay, like if I have some better informed experts, they can make they can submit their votes and also predict some other people's votes, and the system will gather that together to sort of pick out that expert opinion from the minority of voters. And unfortunately, that runs into serious problems with Kleros and with sort of blockchain-based systems in general, in that it's like there are lots of attackers in blockchain world, and you have to build the system to be robust and resistant to attackers without needing the intervention of a centralized party who can just like kick the attackers off of the platform, as you might have in sort of a Web 2 crowd platform. So in particular, you have to like think about what's going to happen if the attackers pretend to be enlightened minorities that have some expert opinion that others like don't have access to. Like what happens if some attackers come along and say that the right answer is Pittsburgh, and Harrisburg, that's the like deceiving answer that someone might fall into if they weren't well informed. And if you're not careful, like your surprisingly popular mechanisms can give too much weight to well-organized coalitions of attackers like that. So ultimately, like a lot of these peer prediction systems, like you have to pay attention to what happens when you have colluding groups, and some of them are more resistant to collusion than others. Some researchers have been thinking about like what the right kind of peer prediction mechanisms are for a blockchain environment. So Faltings and his group have a few papers on sort of like peer prediction in a blockchain environment, and so there's lots of promising work on that. But it's still somewhat more limited than the like larger world of peer prediction mechanisms that would have been available in a less attack rich sort of world. Okay, so that's on some level disappointing, but peer prediction is still useful to us in that there's not only this question of like providing extra weighting to surprisingly popular answers, but there are other goals that peer prediction manages to achieve. So one sort of question that is very relevant to Kleros is what happens if you have types of cases that are kind of predictable? Like what happens if you have a business that creates a bunch of cases using Kleros Enterprise, where like they outsource all of their customer support or something to Kleros. They have cases between the business, always the same business, and like a whole bunch of clients. And you notice that you look at statistics on past cases, and the business like always wins because they don't bother to raise a case unless they unless they think they're right. They know their terms and services better than the client does. And you realize that like 97% of the time or whatever, the business is going to win. And then the question poses itself: what happens if the Kleros jurors notice this and they decide, okay, like yeah, okay, I can spend my time and effort analyzing this case, or I could just always vote for the business. I'll be right 97% of the time. And maybe I'll even just set up a bot that will do this for me every time I'm drawn as a juror. And how can you make Kleros resistant to that? So that you don't wind up in this sort of like dynamic where jurors are doing what we call this lazy strategy. So in Kleros 1.0, our solution to this is that you tune two parameters: the arbitration fees that jurors are paid, and the deposits that they can lose if they are ruled to have voted incorrectly. With the idea being that if the deposit's really, really big, that you lose a lot of money if you vote on the wrong side, that the sort of like extra edge you get by spending a little more time and really analyzing the evidence, making a real decision based on the case, rather than executing the lazy strategy. You're not going to be right 100% of the time, even if you put in the effort. But you'll get an extra edge. You'll be right that much more often instead of being right 97% of the time, because that's the rate at which the business always wins. You'll be right 99% of the time. And that difference of that extra 2% makes a big enough difference because you're losing fewer of these very large deposits. That it's the difference between losing money on average over time if you execute a lazy strategy versus making money and being compensated for that as a juror if you're putting in the time and effort to analyze the case. And an issue with that is that if the cases are really unbalanced, if like there's an option really very close to 100% of the time, that in order to adjust the parameters, the deposits and fees enough to sort of make the lazy strategy unprofitable and the honest strategy profitable, means you wind up with really large deposits, which can create user experience issues. People, risk-averse people might not be comfortable with the idea that their deposit, the deposit they could lose if they, maybe honestly vote against the majority on a case, is like a very large amount of money compared to the fees that they can earn on an average case. Even if it means that on average they get a positive expected return, but like once in a blue moon they get just like a huge loss, that can be an issue for people. And so what can we do to attack this problem? And one idea that we've sort of drawn from the peer prediction literature is the following. So imagine you have the fee and deposit parameters again, F and D. And now, in addition to asking people to vote, you ask for people to provide a prediction of how the other people will vote. So sort of in peer prediction style. And then you give people's payoffs are determined by this formula. The info score equals the thing in the brackets. Or more precisely, that's part of people's payoffs. It's the part of the people's payoffs that rewards them or penalizes them based on the vote, VI. There'll be some other term that rewards or penalizes people based on their YIs, and it's like really standard. You can use the same thing that people always use in peer prediction. But so like their vote information is rewarded or penalized based on this formula. And what does this formula do? Well, if they're right, their payoff is fixed. And if they're wrong, they lose part of their deposit. How much of a part of their deposit? Well, it depends on the peer predictions. And if you look at this, you'll sort of see that if they're the only person that voted VI, um, then then they will get a very large percentage of the deposit lost. Or rather, if people predict that no one will vote for VI, then they will lose their entire deposit. And if people thought that based on their peer predictions that that VI was plausible choice, it was a close case that lots of reasonable choices could be had. Reasonable people can disagree, then they won't lose too much of their deposit. With the idea being that if a juror is executing the lazy strategy, they will come upon sort of clear-cut cases where they're wrong on the kind of the less common answer wins. The juror, it's clear-cut. Everybody votes for the less common answer, but the juror with the lazy strategy doesn't because they didn't put in the effort to read the case. So they get a huge penalty because that answer was seen as being clear-cut, so they lose the entire deposit. But if you're a juror that uses the honest strategy, most of the time that you're wrong is going to be the hardest cases, and then you're penalized relatively little because the other jurors also thought that those cases were sort of challenging, and they predicted that many people would vote on sort of either side of the case. So then what winds up happening with this is that the deposits are still really big compared to sort of the fees you can make, but you lose the whole deposit rarely. You'll only lose the large deposit if not only voting correctly, but also people think that your incorrect vote is just really out of the blue and entirely unjustified, and the case was clear and you were still wrong. So that might have better UX, and we're continuing to explore approaches like this that could sort of better handle this problem. Could disincentivize lazy strategies while still having good user experience. Okay, so to summarize, in some sense, peer prediction is very directly related to Kleros. It's very natural to use its mechanisms. Unfortunately, in a blockchain setting, some of their assumptions are realistic about including participants or manipulation. So that reduces what mechanisms are usable in Kleros. Also, sometimes there are just sort of practical things about some peer prediction mechanisms that would be hard to implement in a blockchain setting. If the maximum penalty that the peer prediction mechanism pays out, it requires people to pay sometimes, is X, then everybody in a blockchain world is going to have to lock up X in advance to cover the possibility that they would have to pay that penalty. Because in blockchains, you can only penalize people what they've already locked up as a deposit. You can't sue someone easily in a state court to recover money they owe you that they haven't paid on the platform. So those provide limitations. Nonetheless, there are some researchers who are already starting to think about blockchain setting peer prediction, and generally there's a lot of interesting research questions, I think, between this fusion of social choice theory, sort of voting systems, traditionally related to economics and peer prediction, more incentive systems traditionally related to computer science, in that if you have a blockchain mechanism, in Kleros, for example, that uses some voting and incentive system where an attacker wants to manipulate the outcome of the vote. So they're trying to manipulate the aggregation of the votes, creating vote splitting is relevant to them, trying to somehow manipulate the vote through bribes or a 51% attack. Then when you feed that into the incentive system and you try to determine what the attacker has to pay, what this attack costs them, particularly if the attack fails, how much are they penalized, then you really have to think about the relationship between the incentive system and the nuances of how the voting system works. So I feel there's a lot of very interesting sort of research to be done at the intersection of these fields. Okay, so moving on, notice that we talked a lot about lazy strategies. Lazy strategies depend somewhat on exactly what your voting system is. So, for example, if you used approval voting, maybe your lazy strategy wouldn't be the same as if you used ranked voting. An approval voting lazy strategy might be just for everyone to always approve everything. You sort of, it's a lazy strategy in the sense that you don't look at the evidence of the individual case. A case comes before you and you just check every possible outcome. And then how you would want to disincentivize that, will depend a lot on what the voting system is. Okay, one type of case, one type of voting system, and one type of category of options that is particularly relevant is disputes with numerical outcomes. So you might want this for cases that want to pay out partial settlements, particularly if you have some kind of decentralized insurance. Maybe someone buys a decentralized insurance policy, and the maximum payout is X. But typically, people aren't paid out the entirety of X. They're paid out some intermediate amount, which depends on how much they've suffered in damages. And you want the jurors to determine that, to figure out what people's damages are, to determine appropriate payoffs. And then how do you do that? Well, if people just sort of naively just voted for a number and you take the most popular number, this is like a straw man sort of argument, something that obviously doesn't work, then that very quickly runs into problems. Sort of vote splitting would be very severe because it's unlikely that people will produce exactly the same number. On the other hand, because you have numerical outcomes in the options are all numbers, you have an additional structure to these options that you don't have if you just have sort of these multiple choice ranked votes. It makes sense to take the average or the median of what the jurors' votes are. And then what's the best voting system for this? So this is something we thought a lot about. We have a paper that I published with Clement many years ago at this point, where jurors are asked to provide a number outcome. And sort of the interesting approach of this paper is that you not only provide a single number, but people provide a range, like an interval. Everybody's going to say that the option should be between A and B, and inevitably any given question is going to have some intrinsic noise. It's hard to make a sort of a fine distinction between saying, okay, someone suffered 35% damages versus 38% damages. At some point, you're literally borderline, and you can't determine some clear cutoff. So you say, okay, their damages are between 35 and 40, and you take the intervals for each person, and you sort of piece them together in a way that gives you a collective outcome whose precision, how small the people's collective interval is tuned to what the individual jurors say their intervals are, how much noise they think there is on an individual level. Okay. So that's something that still could potentially be improved to have better future mechanisms that can build on what we've done, or maybe even do something radically different, particularly if you don't care so much about precision, but have some other priorities, what would be the best mechanisms for numerical outcomes then. Okay. So something that I've been sort of bringing up periodically through this conversation so far is that you need your system to be attack resistant. That we've had these 51% attacks on juror selection. I've mentioned various attacks on juror voting, and now broadly, what are the categories of attacks on juror voting? Well, the sort of big attack is for an attacker to try to bribe somebody, to take the jurors, they've already been chosen, and corrupt them somehow. Say, okay, please vote for Bob, and if you vote for Bob, I will give you some bribe. And in fact, because everything's on a blockchain, that bribe can be enforced with a smart contract. You don't have to trust the sort of shady person who's trying to bribe you. You can see that their payment will be automatically executed as long as you vote for Bob, following the logic of some smart contract. And a particularly problematic kind of bribe for a shelling point system is what's called a P plus epsilon attack. So this idea was introduced in a blog article by Vitalik Buterin back in 2015. where basically in a shelling mechanism, so imagine, go back to binary cases where people will have two options. However, you can consider P plus epsilon attacks on multiple choice systems as well. Then, like, say the honest answer is X, but the attacker wants Y to pass. Then what they'll do is they offer each voter a bribe if they vote for Y, conditional on X being the majority outcome, which seems strange, but the rationale for this is that if you have a big attacker that tells everyone there's an attack, provides a smart contract saying, okay, like, as long as you vote for Y, you'll either be rewarded by the system because Y will win, and you will be rewarded for voting on the dominant side of a shelling coin mechanism, or if you're penalized, I'll make it up for you. I will pay you not only what you lost and what you could have earned, but also a little more, a bribe, and everyone will determine, okay, like, I'm in a sort of like no-lose situation here as long as I take the bribe. And if I vote honestly and I don't take the bribe, like, if the bribe wins, then I could lose. I could be penalized. So everybody, sort of reasoning like that, takes the bribe, which means that the bribe succeeds, and the attacker doesn't have to pay out anything because he only paid out conditional on the bribe losing. So this is a particularly challenging attack for shelling point systems. Really, an attack that's aimed directly at this sort of focal point, shelling point mechanism that underlies Kleros and other similar systems. And we've done a lot of research on this as well. And we've determined that, sort of unsurprisingly, the exact payoff structure of your payoff matrix matters a lot in exactly how viable this attack is. So imagine you have M jurors in a round, M total votes. And again, they're positive if you vote incoherently as D. And you have a payoff table that looks like this. So this looks kind of complicated. But the idea, basically, is that you take people's lost deposits and you redistribute them to the voters who are on the winning side. So now it's not just that, like, I'm wrong, my deposit is lost, but I'm wrong, my deposit is lost, and it goes to the person who was right. And that gives you a formula that looks like this. And when you do this, rather than the sort of like the simpler payoff matrix we had a couple slides ago, the attacker can do the same thing. They can pay a bribe that, like, not only pays you back your D if you're in the sort of lower left corner here, but it pays you what you could have earned if by voting coherently plus epsilon. So that gets you into the lower left corner of the diagram on the right. And then you take advantage of the fact that Kleros has an appeal system. So if, say, you're in an appeal round with 3 jurors, 2 of them take the bribe, you're honest, you vote for Alice, who you think is the right answer. And then if there's an appeal to a larger panel of jurors, maybe they vote for Alice. And if they do, the way Kleros works, you're rewarded for having voted with the ultimate right answer, even if you voted against the answer provided by the other people in your round. And then when you think about how that works with the sort of payoff matrices from a couple slides ago, the attacker, like, you're basically paid M-1 different people's lost deposit, and the attacker needs to pay out each M voter a large enough bribe so that they don't sort of defect and vote for the honest answer. They're going to need to cover this amount for each juror. Like, each juror could get this sort of like lone voice of reason jackpot by defecting and voting honestly if they think they're going to win the appeal. So for the attacker to succeed, they need to keep all these people on board, or at least enough of them so that they win the case. And if they really pay them enough so that they don't have an incentive to defect, then that scales as the number of jurors squared. And because there's this extra square and what the attacker sort of like worst case payout is, that means that the amount of money they need to lock up to have a convincing attack will actually grow faster than the amount that the jurors deposit. And it can potentially, if you have a large enough panel of jurors and a high enough appeal, can exceed the entire supply of PNK. So this is an important defense against people's epsilon attacks. So notice, just in passing, that when Vitalik wrote that blog article about P plus epsilon attacks, one of his main examples was blockchain consensus algorithms themselves. Specifically proof of work. Proof of stake was still sort of embryonic at the time, where you have it's the same structure. If you're a miner on a proof of work network, and you mine on one of two sides of a fork, you're only rewarded if your fork ultimately is adopted into the network. So it has the same structure of a shelling game, where you vote for one of two sides of this binary choice, and you're incentivized to vote for how you think everybody else is going to vote, namely how everybody else is going to mine, which is the two sides of the fork. And you can apply a P plus epsilon attack to this same system. So in some sense, like a lot of the research we do on Kleros, because of this connection that like proof of consensus, proof of work, proof of stake, consensus algorithms have this common structure with Kleros and with shelling point systems, a lot of the research we do is applicable to both. The papers we've written, often the sort of two examples are Kleros and then the proof of work or proof of stake. So, the research we have is not only necessarily just specifically focused on us, but it is generally applicable to other blockchain cryptoeconomic systems. Okay, so moving on, talking about just sort of other research topics that didn't fit into like sort of the first two main themes. So we said there's this notion of appealing. You can appeal to a larger panel of jurors. What if you do that frivolously? What if like you appeal when like the answer was clear and you shouldn't have appealed? So in Kleros, as you appeal, the panels of jurors grow exponentially. So it doubles +1 every time. So you go from 3 to 7 to 15 to 31. And the panel just gets larger and larger, which means that the fee that you have to pay these people will scale linearly with the panel size, so exponentially with the number of appeals you're on. And if you're some giant whale that's appealing frivolously, that's ultimately going to lose at the end of the day, the large enough appeal is going to rule that you were wrong, then the cost that you spend can become quite large. And generally, just like how large depends on the sort of trade-off between basically the resistance to two broad categories of attacks. If it's easier to appeal, if it's like the appeal fees are less relative to the sort of juror per round fees, that means that it's easier to execute these frivolous appeal attacks, but it becomes harder to bribe, because that means you can always like appeal a bribe, including a P plus epsilon attack, to a larger panel that could reverse the bribe result. If it's harder to appeal, then that you have less resistance to bribe attacks, but obviously, frivolous appeal attacks are less of a problem. So you need to sort of calibrate the system so that you have broad resistance to both categories of attacks without creating being too vulnerable to the other. Okay, so one of our approaches to trying to make sure that appeals are accessible is to have litigation crowdfunding, so people can stake on behalf of the appeal, like funding the appeal fees of an option that they think has a good chance of ultimately winning. This can make sure that appeals are accessible. And as I sort of got to earlier, when you have non-binary litigation crowdfunding, because you have sort of some complicated non-binary dispute between lots of possible different answers, some of which are more reasonable than others, then you need a sort of mechanism for what people are rewarded if they participate in the litigation crowdfunding, depending on what happens, that takes that into account. And we spent time thinking about like the appropriate way for that to look. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about sort of a broad, it's not even really a category of attack, but more of a sort of an attack model for how you expect people to behave in a blockchain environment. So griefing and griefers. So again, this sort of idea is due to Vitalik. He had this blog article called The Triangle of Harm from 2016, where basically he asks the question, what if people are willing to just lose money to cause harm to others? Which is something that like you observe sometimes. People are trolls and they're willing to take on a small loss to themselves if they can, for the lulz, if they can do enough harm to others. The word griefing comes from the language of video games, where people will adopt a play strategy where they don't really help themselves, but they just sort of like antagonize other people because they find that amusing. And what does it mean that some of your participants in your system may adopt this point of view, like have this kind of personality type? So what Vitalik proposes is that we should think about participants in a blockchain system in terms of their grief, like the griefing factor they're willing to take on, or alternatively their strategies in terms of the griefing factors that those strategies have. And the griefing factor is defined as the quotient between the harm that the attacker does and the cost that they do to themselves to do that harm. So maybe like an attacker can do financial harm. They can spend 1 ETH to do 100 ETH of harm. That has a griefing factor of 100. Sometimes you can have griefing factors that are sort of denominated in other things. So for example, you could have you could have harm in terms of delay or time. So an attacker could do 1 ETH of harm to cause a crypto economic system to just halt for 6 months. And then, your griefing factor is like 6 months to 1 ETH. And having adopted this kind of point of view, we've analyzed Kleros from the perspective of grief that can be performed in Kleros, trying to make Kleros as resistant to griefing participants as possible. One obvious and standard grief is what we call the delay grief, which in some sense is just the frivolous appeal attack over again, only if the attacker's goal is really just to delay the system and they don't have any expectation of being able to ultimately win out by either sort of outspending everybody else, so they appeal past other people's resources to continue appealing, or to eventually just sort of win a jury vote. So here, the attacker spends money to just keep appealing because that delays the system. How much does it delay the system? Well, they can appeal n times, and because the number of jurors grows as 2n, it costs them sort of O2n, or sort of like some constant amount times 2n in ETH or in DAI or whatever to appeal this many times. But they only get 1 additional week or however many additional days, depending on the court, for each additional appeal. So their griefing factor is it decreases exponentially as the number of appeals increases. There's been some interesting research by others that we've thought about and tried to include in our thoughts. People have compared griefing sort of actors to evolutionary stability in sort of specific types of games, in the sense of game theory, where the idea is that, maybe it's not in the interest of a griefing participant to grief in a single run of the game, but if you repeat the game over and over again and you think about how the pool of participants will change based on how they're reacting to whether they're gaining or losing in the game, then maybe if you take a really long-term point of view, then the grief becomes rational. So a standard example is in proof-of-work networks, maybe a griefer or an attacker that is applying the strategy might spend much more electricity than makes sense to mine at a loss. And in doing so, they drive up the difficulty of the network so that it becomes harder for everybody else to find blocks because the difficulty is increased. and nobody else who's behaving sort of rationally. Is it worth it for them to spend enough money on electricity or buy enough mining hardware to continue participating in these conditions? So they drop out, and the only person left is the attacker. And particularly if there are sort of non-negligible transition costs, once people have like left the system and sold their mining hardware, they've repurposed it for something else. The attacker is the only person left that still has like mining hardware, and they've taken over the system. So you have to think about Greece also in this kind of like long-term view. One tool that we've developed in a paper that I wrote a year or two ago looks at what I call the phase diagrams of equilibria, where if you imagine that your system has some players who may or may not be griefers, how resistant to the system is the system? How robust is the system if you vary the griefing factors at which the griefers are willing to participate? You're like, okay, maybe I have a lot of people who are willing to troll the system if they can get a griefing factor of 100 because they're getting like really good value for the harm they do themselves in terms of how much amusement they can get from harm to others. But maybe there are not so many participants that'd be willing to perform a griefing factor of 1/100th. And then as the participants in the system's griefing factors change, the equilibrium of the system change. And these sort of phase diagrams give you a visual picture of how robust you are. Like, how is the sort of equilibrium that you've designed your system around take up a lot of space in the picture? Is it something that like it's a really small region, and as soon as you bring in like even a small number of griefers, that you might get knocked out of? So this gives you some sense of the stability of a system with respect to griefing participants. Okay, so another key sort of set of questions related to Kleros and cryptoeconomic systems in general is how do you handle information flow? So one obvious set of questions that like one would hope to have good answers to is, what about cases that have confidential evidence? We want to have jurors review people's cases, but maybe like that involves looking at business secrets that you don't want your competitor to see. And how do you keep that information from coming out? And unfortunately, there are just fundamental limits on how secure you can be in keeping crowdsourced information confidential. Like Kleros is ultimately a crowdsourced platform. Like the information is going to the crowd to review your case, and there's almost no way around like the jurors seeing the information. And as soon as they do, like it's hard. You can't have absolute guarantees that somebody won't leak the information. It might be possible to do things where you kind of watermark the evidence so that different jurors, practically see the same evidence, but like there are very slight differences that don't matter in terms of how they would resolve the case. But then if there's a juror that publishes evidence or leaks to somebody else, you might be able to trace the juror that back to the juror who originally was given the evidence and penalize them based on the watermark. So there are limitations on that. We have some ideas about how to handle confidential evidence in very specific special cases. So imagine, just as like a thought experiment for a moment, that you had a flight insurance decentralized application. And a user wants to be reimbursed because she missed her flight or the flight was canceled. And what she can do is you can have like a curated list of which flights are canceled without saying which users are on which flight, which passengers are on which flight. And then the user can, like, that information can be adjudicated by Kleros. Like, Kleros can decide, yeah, this flight is canceled. No, this flight is not canceled. And then the user can somehow, like, prove that she was on a given flight using a zero-knowledge proof without saying, like, which of the canceled flights it was on the curated list. So this is, like, something you could do to keep some information confidential. It's dependent on the fact that there's this very specific format of the case where the information that you actually care about being confidential, the passenger information about who's on which flight, is not the information that is likely to be disputed, or at least the information that the blockchain needs to resolve the cases, which is which flights were canceled. So you can separate people's confidential information from the sort of like information that Kleros gives. It's not hard. It's not obvious to generalize how you can do that to different types of cases, but maybe there are other examples. So that's something that one can continue to explore. Another sort of different question about how you handle situations where information is flowing is what about keeping juror votes secret? And there's sort of two different questions here. I'm going to talk about both of them. Like keeping juror votes secret during the voting period and after the voting period, like having the vote be secret forever. So juror vote secrecy during the voting period seems like it would be important. It's like if you run a Schelling point system, jurors are incentivized to vote how other jurors are going to vote. We even said in the definition of a Schelling point back many slides ago that the core idea of Schelling points, of focal points, is that there's solutions that people gravitate towards in the absence of communication. Well, what if people are communicating and jurors are saying how they're going to vote? Then like that can influence how I vote. Like I see this other person's going to vote for Bob. Well, maybe I should vote for Bob too. And then even if Bob wasn't the right answer, maybe everybody votes for Bob. So you don't want this information to like get out during the voting period, ideally. And a mechanism which is already implemented in some Kleros courts is what's called commit and reveal. So the idea here is that when you vote in sort of in two phases, a commit phase and a reveal phase. So in the commit phase, you decide on your vote. So you say, I'm going to vote for Bob. And you draw a random number, and you hash the number together with your vote. So the hash, you put both of them together into a hash function. A hash function being this sort of like cryptographic function that gives you like the fingerprint of a piece of data. That it's sort of like hard to invert. So if you have the fingerprint, you can't easily go back to the data, but it's easy to check. If you have the data you put in, you can check that the fingerprints match. And then you publish the fingerprint, you publish the hash. And then when the reveal period comes, you publish the random value and your vote, and the smart contract can check easily that matched the hash value provided. So it counts your vote accordingly. And if you provided something that didn't match the hash value, then the smart contract would reject it because the vote would be invalid. Okay, so in this way, you prevent the vote from being sort of visibly seen during the voting period. So there are some usability issues with this. What happens if you forget to reveal? This process requires this like second action. You had to commit and then also reveal. The revealing thing is kind of like anticlimactic. You spent a whole bunch of time thinking about the case when you committed, and then, oh yeah, I had to go back and reveal. You're not doing anything there except for just clicking a button. But if you don't click that button, then the system doesn't know how you voted, and it's going to penalize you as if you didn't vote. So one solution that we have to this problem that I think this problem is more or less solved at this point. It's just a matter of implementing the solution. Is using what's called threshold encryption. So conveniently, another project called Shutter has developed threshold encryption systems for various situations. Specifically, they think a lot about like preventing MEV. So having like DeFi applications where the order of transactions on the DeFi application is blinded, so you don't know what things are going to happen in when you send your DeFi transaction. Like people can't see what your transaction is until it's already committed and it's sort of in line to be executed. So like a block producer can't see, oh, he's going to sell whatever, and then sandwich attack you by sort of manipulating the prices of before and after you buy, before and after you sell. But you can use the same technology to have votes that basically automatically reveal in Kleros. So what happens here is that you you encrypt your vote under a key, under a threshold encryption key, which no single actor possesses, but there's like a cloud of key keepers who each have a piece of the key, and then there's a mechanism by which they can sort of assemble their keys at the end of the voting period to decrypt the votes. And as long as they do that, you have redundancy. There are lots of key keepers. You need some percentage of them though to decrypt the key. So as long as like not too many of them collude to reveal early, and not too many of them like go offline to prevent you from revealing at all, you can count on all the information being revealed at the end of the voting period. So, okay. So now we've resolved this issue of like the user experience of having votes revealing by having this sort of like auto reveal procedure. But like there's this other even deeper problem in commit and reveal, or just using commit and reveal kind of naively, in that, yeah, okay, I'm capable of hiding my vote during the vote period or during the commit period. It won't be seen, people only see the hash, and then we'll automatically reveal at the end of the reveal, during the reveal period. But that doesn't prevent me from telling my vote early. I can do what is called a pre-revelation attack, where I publish my vote and the random value before I'm supposed to, and then I'm right back in the situation I was before, where this information floating around might convince other people to vote along with me. So here, because someone is deviating from the protocol, you're in the situation of having an explicit attack, but you need a mechanism to sort of disincentivize this attack. So our thoughts on this is to use Kleros itself to punish pre-revelation. So if somebody can come up with evidence and say, okay, like juror 2 provided their vote too early, and I have this evidence. The evidence could take many different forms. Maybe they just published the vote in the salt, the vote in the random value. Maybe they provided a zero knowledge proof that they voted in a certain way without actually publishing the random value. Maybe they did like a variety of other things. They can provide a smart contract that will penalize them if they don't vote for bot, if they don't vote in a certain way. So you don't fully know how they voted, but you can pretty much know how they voted unless they're willing to burn a lot of money penalizing themselves. So there are lots of different ways that people can sort of circulate pre-revelation information, which ultimately comes down to the fact that blockchains exist in this very rich ecosystem of information floating around, and you as a mechanism designer have great difficulty controlling what information is going to circulate. But regardless, Kleros jurors can look at all of that holistically and be like, okay, I see that the attacker published a ZK proof or whatever, and I accept that that's some form of pre-revelation attack, and one way or another, I can determine that they should be penalized, so I vote to penalize them. So that's something that Kleros 2.0 can incorporate to kind of disincentivize this kind of attack. So that's all about keeping juror votes secret during the case, before the case is over, during the voting period. There's also this related question about whether juror votes can be kept secret after a case is over. If a juror votes many times over on Kleros on different types of cases, over time, eventually they might develop a kind of voting profile. People could look at that and try to glean information about that person based on the types of cases they vote on and how they vote. Maybe that would be usable to de-anonymize people in some way, in some limited way. And all else being equal, maybe we would prefer that just to not be available, and for that information to just never become seen. There is, again, an interesting sort of research proposal by Vitalik. He has this ETH research post about what he calls the minimal anti-collusion infrastructure, or MACI, where he has this system where people are voting in a way, and it should be impossible to prove the way you vote. And particularly that can be very useful for collusion resistance or bribe resistance or resistance to a variety of other forms of attacks. Because if you can't prove that you voted for Bob, and Bob is bribing you to vote for him, Bob probably isn't going to trust you if you just say you voted for him without proof to pay out the bribe. So it adds like great difficulty in sort of it adds friction to sort of corrupt interactions, attacks of various forms. And unfortunately, it's very difficult or basically impossible to apply Mackie to Kleros directly because jurors are rewarded or penalized based on how they vote. And that information is visible, so it gives away how people voted. If you, as an observer, look at the case, you blind everybody's votes, it never becomes visible. You use some kind of like zero knowledge aggregation mechanism to like put the votes together to determine that Alice won without seeing who individually voted for what. But then you still somehow implement the incentives, the penalties and rewards. Well, you can see that Alice won. She got the money out of the smart contract escrow or whatever. And then you can see that the two of the jurors were penalized or were rewarded, and one of them is penalized. So you can conclude that the two that were rewarded voted for Alice, and the one that was penalized voted for Bob. So somehow you need to hide that information too. And it should be possible to adapt Mackie so that this information is also hidden along with the voting information itself. And then you'd have to do something where fees somehow accumulate, the juror rewards accumulate over time, perhaps through a different address, and then you issue some kind of zero knowledge proof to cash out of the system that proves that, okay, I voted correctly in like this case, in this case, in this case, and I voted incorrectly in this other case, and that's all the votes that I had, so that I can't just conveniently admit which cases I incorrectly voted in. So the system knows that I shouldn't do whatever in sort of total fees. And then all of that information should be provable via zero-knowledge proof to the system without actually giving away the details of that calculation in a way that people observing can see. So that's potentially a long-term improvement that can be made to the protocol. Okay, so another research sort of question, challenge that I would like to talk about is what we call the challenger's dilemma. So this is specific to curated lists. We've talked a little bit about curated lists already in the context of cell-bound tokens or proof of humanity. There are many curated lists that use Kleros. Again, the core idea is that some user submits something to a list, whether it's their own profile on proof of humanity or they submit a token to a list of tokens that satisfy basic sort of due diligence requirements. They provide a deposit when they do that. Challengers can observe the pending submissions that are entering the list, and they can flag. They have some period of time in which they can flag a malicious submission to raise a Kleros dispute over whether the submission belongs on the list or not. And then when you're incentivizing the challenger, you realize that there's this unfortunate kind of loop of their incentives, where if you have many challengers who are really actively patrolling the list, well, that means that all of the submissions that are incorrect are going to be flagged. So people are going to be more careful. There aren't going to be very many attacks. It's not going to be financially worthwhile to attack the system. So you'll have fewer incorrect submissions, which means that the challenger reward will fall. So you'll have fewer challengers in equilibrium. So now there are fewer challengers, so maybe they don't notice all the incorrect submissions. There's a little less rigor. So people get sloppy with their submissions, and more incorrect submissions arise. And gradually the challenger reward increases, and you go back to where you started. And in practice, you could imagine that you wind up in an equilibrium where most things that are challengeable are challenged. Most things that are incorrect are refused from the list. But there's some that slip through because the challengers kind of act like a self-financing police force, where the police force is financing itself through fines that they impose on people. And based on this sort of logic here, you just can't expect that kind of mechanism, the self-financing police, to drive crime all the way to zero. And then you need to basically ask yourself, how catastrophic it is to have a submission that sneaks onto the list that maybe shouldn't be there. Ideally, it's maybe just like an edge case. Like how bad is that for your curated list? If you have a curated list like Proof of Humanity, it's Sybil resistant. It should be hard to get an extra profile. But if every once in a while somebody gets something sneaks onto the list, it's maybe not the end of the world. Somebody has 2 profiles instead of 1, that's not great, but it also doesn't allow them to take over the DAO or to have too great an influence on a list that already has tens of thousands of users. On other curated lists, it might be worse. Like maybe if your curated list is non-fraudulent token addresses of common tokens, and someone sneaks through 1 token address that's fraudulent, that can be used to attack many users of that token and create great damage. So you have to think about just how bad is something that goes unchallenged onto a curated list. And something that we thought about to address this issue is your choice of policy. So curated lists that use Kleros generally have some policy that define exactly what the criteria are to be on the list. And basically, we think it's a good idea that your policy should have some conditions that are helpful in keeping the list clean, that are important conditions and good to have, but aren't necessarily completely catastrophic if violated. And this way, ideally, your edge cases, the things that might sneak through, wind up being about the sort of nice-to-have conditions rather than being about things that are truly essential. So maybe for the list of non-fraudulent token addresses, the Kleros tokens list, in addition to providing the address of the token and the name, people are also required to provide a logo, which needs to be of a high enough quality that it can be displayed on various interfaces as they use the list. We noticed that many of the disputes wind up being about the logo quality, or whether the logo is appropriate, rather than about the address of the token, which is a good thing because you wind up in a situation where the cases that are kind of borderline wind up being about the logo, and jurors challengers are incentivized to participate actively in the list to make sure that reviewing submissions, because sometimes they're rewarded for these logo sort of questions, and because they're there reviewing logo, they also have they're engaged enough to also review the address, and then what winds up being truly important, that the address is right, is sort of reliably checked. Okay, and generally this sort of gets at a broader point about just user engagement, and just kind of on a social level, how enthusiastic people are about using your list. That if your list is not getting very much engagement, you may not have a healthy challenger ecosystem, even if the incentives seem theoretically really solid. Part of this is just because challengers have an economy of scale. If you have lots of entries to review every time they sit down in front of a list, that makes more sense than if there's a one-off submission every once in a while to look at. An experiment that Kleros did, the Kleros Cooperative performed many years ago in the sort of early days of the project, was we had a curated list of Doge images, these Shiba Inu dog meme images, where people were rewarded a certain amount in Dogecoin if they provided Doge images, and the sort of point of the experiment was to see that the list was resistant to people submitting images of cats. So if you submitted a cat and it got through successfully on the list, there was a 50 ETH reward, which wasn't worth quite as much as it is now, but it was still a lot of money at the time. Interestingly, the one image of a cat sort of unambiguously got onto the list, and it was very late in the pilot, very late in this experiment, after the Doge reward had actually already ended. So people no longer were eligible for the reward in Dogecoin, but the cat reward was still pending. And because the list had been around for a few months, people were sort of less engaged. People no longer had an incentive to submit new elements to the list because the Dogecoin reward was no longer there. So people just weren't going to the website. And the image of the cat that snuck through didn't win a juror case where jurors determined that it was actually a Doge. It just wasn't challenged at all because people just weren't actively looking at the website. So in some sense, that's ironic because at that point, the only people who had an incentive to submit anything to the list were people trying to get the cat reward because the Doge reward was already over. So similarly, if everyone was economically rational, you would think every submission was a cat, and it would just make sense to challenge everything. But ultimately, like theoretical economic incentives are one thing, and sort of the social dynamics of your users are another. So that's something you have to keep in mind. Okay, and sort of continuing on this point about sort of the social dynamics of your users, one thing that we've observed in some lists is that many of the challenges come from like only a handful of challengers that seem to be very motivated, and they can be motivated by economic returns. But also, there's some research from behavioral economics that might incline one to believe that people can be motivated to challenge just out of social reasons as well. They want to keep the list clean because they're part of a community that uses the list, and they want to participate in that community. So this is related to experiments people have done on what are called strong reciprocators, people in certain sort of evolutionary game theory models that go beyond their incentives to punish norm breakers. And then there are questions about like exactly how this kind of behavior would manifest itself in curated lists. So that's something to do experiments on and explore. One other topic I'd like to talk about before we wrap up is governance and Kleros governance. So we talked about various parameters that exist in the Kleros protocol, about how fees and deposits can be adjusted to reduce the profitability of lazy strategies. So that was something we talked about several topics ago. There are other parameters as well. The length of the voting period is a changeable parameter. The policies in Kleros courts are things that can be voted on by Kleros governance. So basically, the sort of like instructions that jurors have for how they should vote, what kind of evidence is admissible, things like that. And what does this governance look like? Well, it looks similar to the governance of lots of other DAOs. People vote on propositions up or down. Their vote is token weighted, and people use tools like Snapshot and other tools that people use for DAO governance. I like to think of the governance of Kleros as kind of like a labor union, in that the jurors of Kleros are determining the conditions of their work. They're determining like what the fees and deposits are, and the norms, the policies. So, like on some level, maybe that's healthy, but it does raise the question of why we have to have these parameters. Is it possible to have the system with less parameters? This gets to the idea of governance minimization, that if you're a user of a platform, if the fewer parameters there are, the more predictable it is for you as a user. You can rely on the fact that the platform isn't going to change in the future because it's sort of like hard-coded into some smart contract that it's just going to stay the way it is. And what would it look like if you tried to like governance minimize Kleros? So imagine you tried to do something that was a little more market-oriented. I mean, obviously Kleros is built out of economic incentives already, but one thing that you might think of if you were really trying to lean into sort of kind of standard ideas from liberal economics would be to say, okay, like, why are the jurors all being paid the same amount of money to judge cases? Why, from one case to another, like, why do I need the collectivity, the DAO governance to decide the parameters should change for the fee that jurors are receiving, when instead jurors could just say the fee they're willing to work at, and the system could automatically adjust so the jurors are paid that. There's some kind of market clearing fee where like supply meets demand, and you pick all the jurors that are willing to work at a given price. So the problem with that is that you could imagine very easily a attacker, again, it always comes back to trying to make the system attack resistant, could just set a really low fee pretend that they're really efficient and can work for really cheap, when in fact they don't actually care about receiving the economic reward to be a juror in the case, and they just want to manipulate the outcome of some Kleros case. And because their fee is so much less than everybody else, they're selected with much higher weight, and maybe they take over a system. So, like, you think you have some kind of supply and demand relationship from like an Econ 101 class, and you have some market clearing price to produce honest dispute resolution, when in fact, like, there's this other phenomenon going on in the market where there's this other supply curve of people willing to provide dishonest dispute resolution services because they want to create malicious outcomes. And when you're trying to design as a mechanism designer, you think you understand the sort of economic dynamics of your system. Actually, if you sort of like create too much slack for the system to auto-adjust without these kinds of like community-driven parameters, this oversight for the community on how the system should work, you end up in the wrong equilibrium that you didn't anticipate. So, like, you need to be cautious of these kinds of things, of how generally, just to wrap up this question of like what will a system do in the face of attackers, and how can you be robust. So part of that, just to conclude and to summarize, we saw that historically the lack of juror identity mechanisms or blockchain-based identity mechanisms reduced the kinds of mechanisms that were available. And now there are more mechanisms around proof of personhood and SPTs that widens the range of what we can do. So there are lots of interesting research questions to sort of take advantage of these new tools and how they can be best applied. And then these sort of questions around how we design the right voting and incentive system, drawing from both peer prediction and social choice theory to best incentivize people to vote for honest answers and then best aggregate that information that they provide us into good responses is something that we've done a lot of work on. We have good candidates that can be applied in Kleros 2.0, but where you can do a lot more. And because Kleros 2.0 is going to be modular, where you can sort of launch new voting and incentive systems later and have the governance vote on sort of adopting them into the existing modular framework of the court without having to ever have everyone transition from one version of the court to, for example, a Kleros 3.0. There's a lot of room for experimentation where people will be able to take this research on new voting and incentive systems, code it into some future Kleros module, and it will be able to be easily integrated with the next version of Kleros when it's available. And then when doing all of this, always being careful for thinking about like what are the attack vectors, how can the system be robust, and particularly it's how do you handle attackers without protocol incentives? How do you control the flow of information? If you want certain information to be confidential and other not, like what incentives both can you put in place to like prevent people from releasing the information you want to keep secret, and also what cryptographic sort of tools can you use, and how do those fit together? Okay, so that was a really broad overview of a lot of research we've been doing for many years. There's a lot of interesting research questions that are still open, and if any promising researcher is watching this talk and wants to get involved, I encourage you to reach out to us. Thank you.